Good afternoon. Today I'm going to read from a lecture that Dr. Jung gave at the Technical University in Zurich, abbreviated for us English speakers as ETH. And this lecture is from a part of this series of lectures which he gave for 8 years, called the ETH seminars, and in fact it's called Notes of Lectures given at the ETH, and they were given from 1933 to 1941. Now, these lectures are being newly published in this series called History of Modern Psychology, C.G. Jung, lectures delivered at ETH Zurich, and ultimately this is going to be a 8-volume series. This is the first volume that's just been published, called History of Modern Psychology. But I'm jumping ahead because that volume 1 covers 1933, and I'm going to jump ahead to 1944. Because there Dr. Jung is introducing alchemy, and in the process he is talking about the process of individuation. And since that is a perennial popular topic on this channel, I wanted to offer that. Now, I am getting a message that says that the stream health is not good. Could one of the people that's online now, Mared or one of the others, just tell me whether you can see and hear this stream at the moment? Is the stream coming through all right? Okay. No one's responding. Okay, I'm gonna, because it says that I have a number of subscribers watching, I'm going to begin to read, and I am recording this at home, so presumably I will have a good video at least at home. And John says it's all good, so I'm going to keep going. Thank you, sir. Okay. So, this is the introduction to a series of 2-volume series on alchemy that these lectures must have gone on for a couple of years. And so this is the first one on alchemy. So, introduction, lecture 8 November 1940. Professor Fritz Fleiner, our late authority on constitutional law, once said of our Swiss democracy, quote, "It educates the citizen to a higher degree of common sense and responsibility than any other form of government, and enriches his mind with ideas which transcend his private interests and everyday life," unquote. While the former is a task which belongs to political education, the latter gives me a right to speak of a theme which underlies far from the turmoil of present-day events, the process of individuation. For not only political but also psychical equilibrium is undergoing a most violent shock. Obviously, he's talking about the advent of World War II, which had begun about a year earlier. Fortunately, Dr. Jung was in neutral Switzerland, so it wasn't affecting him directly at the time. Individuation, as we understand it here, means a process inside the individual human being, as those of you who attended my former lectures already know. Our age is striving to bring about a conglomeration and organization of enormous masses of people in which the individual suffocates, whereas meditation on the process whereas meditation on the process of individuation leads to the reverse direction, to the problem of the spiritual development of the individual. Necessary as the public organization of the masses is, yet the value of them all depends on the value of the individual. Were one to multiply an idiot by 1,000,000, the results would by no means be a genius. In other words, if the individual is worthless, the nation will be worthless. And if the individual does not flourish, the whole will not flourish. The process of individuation is founded on the instinctive urge of every living creature to reach its own totality and fulfillment. I'm going to go back and read those 2 paragraphs again because I think they're pretty important. Were one to multiply an idiot by 1,000,000, the result would by no means be a genius. In other words, if the individual is worthless, the nation will be worthless, and if the individual does not flourish, the whole will not flourish. The process of individuation is founded on the instinctive urge of every living creature to reach its own totality and fulfillment. The trend of nature in this respect is more toward completeness than perfection. Man, however, is not only unconscious physical nature, he has Man is not only unconscious of his physical nature, he has an ethos as well, which demands goodness, truth, and beauty. Therefore, the merely natural urge comes into conflict with the reflective and valuing spirit, for the latter is constantly trying for its own ends to remodel or turn aside the pure play of nature. It was this conflict which gave rise to those efforts that I have described to you in former lectures with particular examples and in fullest detail. These were, beginning with the East, classical yoga, which aims at yoking the klesis, the natural urges, and the Buddhist exercises in meditation, whose task is that of transforming the yogin into the Buddha. After which, turning to the West, I gave you a detailed account of the Ignatian exercises. He's referring to Saint Ignatius Loyola, I believe, which correspond exactly to Buddhist yoga, though naturally in a Christian form and in keeping with the characteristic psychology of the West. All these methods approach their task with the conscious design of influencing and altering the impetus of nature toward self-fulfillment in an explicit way and in a previously determined direction. They all start from the more or less silent assumption that human consciousness knows exactly what forms and conditions into which nature should transform herself. They do not doubt the possibility of being able to imprint and drill definite forms and formulas on nature, and are apparently quite sure that these forms represent the best and most holy, even the will of God itself. Particularly, the rules of spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius do not leave the smallest loophole where anything unforeseen could slip in or out. While nature is credited with every spontaneity and artifice, the spirit appears as an inexorably inflexibility. The spirit appears as an inexorable inflexibility and as a foredetermined system of irrevocable and absolute validity. The spirit is granted practically no freedom. It does not seem to be credited with any creative activity outside the actual and traditional formulation handed down in human consciousness. For the purpose of disciplining the miles ecclesiae, the soldiers of the church. Okay, let me reread that just with the English. For the purpose of disciplining the soldiers of the church, this limitation is doubtless indispensable, but the Pauline spirit in the Christian religion hardly supports this attitude. In 1 Thessalonians 5:1-9, St. Paul says, "Quench not the spirit, despise not prophesyings, prove all things, hold fast to that which is good." If the freedom of the spirit had not been very active somewhere, such strictly prescribed regulations would hardly have been necessary. The schism in the church, the Reformation, and the numerous sects which sprang into existence give a direct motive for the regulations. These show us the freedom of the spirit at work, but also, unfortunately, its lack of restraint, which the reformers themselves were already obliged to oppose. These historical events speak all too clearly in favor of an authoritative formula, which with relentless severity guides the apparently chaotic spiritual development into certain channels. Nothing indeed has developed inside schismatic religious movements which could in any way be compared with yoga or with the Ignatian exercises. It seems, therefore, as if only the conscious, with its hard and rigid formulas, were the supreme arbiter capable of bridling amoral and boundless nature. It was from this conviction that a firm belief gradually developed in the almighty power of human reason and of the will, and in the identity of spirit with consciousness. But with the growth of this conviction, the ideas of the spontaneity of the spirit also gradually disappeared. For the latter, it seemed constantly needed the support. For the latter, it seemed constantly needed the support of the human will. Good morning or good afternoon. Thank you for coming. I'm reading from an essay from 1940 about the process of individuation. Only nature had instinctive urges, but these were apparently missing in the spirit, so that the latter finally forfeited all importance as a natural phenomenon. The spirit has recently even been represented as the adversary of the soul and as a principal hostile of life. In the same degree in which the spirit forfeited its spontaneous manifesting activity, nature was reduced to pure matter. The physis became physics. But human reason won a disproportionate advantage in this development, which increasingly induced the individual, as well as the masses, to accept the superstition that one could subordinate the totality of life to reason, and thereby make reason the absolute ruler of destiny. But the revolution of enlightenment, which raised the goddess of reason to the throne, ended in a bloody orgy. Now there he's referring to the French Revolution, where the goddess of reason was taken into the Cathedral of Notre Dame, and various horrific things were happening there, including literally orgies. For when the déraison usurps the power, she turns into murderous raison d'état, which only benefit the people in power and never mankind. Reason can only be applied by reasonable people. Otherwise, it is the right means in the wrong hands of the wrong man and brings about destruction. Let me read that once more for you, because so many of our contemporaries think that reason is what everything is about. Reason can only be applied by reasonable people. Otherwise, it is the right means in the hands of the wrong man and brings about destruction. Is the spirit then really a system of ideas, impotent in itself, always dependent on the support of reason and will? Has the spirit really no autonomy? No existence of its own, and no natural dynamis, which could, should the opportunity arise, successfully oppose reason, or, better still, successfully oppose the instinctive power of nature? Is the spirit not also nature, a spiritual nature, just as wild, unruly, and chaotic as the world of physical instincts? In answering this question, history may again be expected to provide us with some examples which will be no less convincing. We need only think of the history of the heresies, of philosophy, and of revolutionary ideas altogether. When we face these mighty phenomena in the history of the spirit, we cannot easily avoid the impression that the impulsive force and the dynamis of the spirit are hardly less than those of the world of physical instincts. A deeper analysis of this phenomena leads us even to doubt whether spiritual nature is so very different from physical nature. Often, indeed, one even has the impression that it is a matter of one and the same nature, merely approaching us in two modalities, whereby both avail themselves of so-called reason in order to slip into the dominion of man and make the kingdom of reason illusory. Nature, indeed, was not originally regarded as merely material, but was fully as much spirit as matter. Nature was permeated with spirit for man in antiquity, and the countenance of God still shines forth from nature in the Theologia Naturalis. If we subject the physical nature of man to a careful analysis, we discover not only physical natural urges in the unconscious, but also spiritual determinants. And as the natural urges are not purely of evil, neither are the spiritual. A representative of the philosophy of nature in the 1st century, A.D. Democritus, pseudonym Democritus, coined the sentence, quote, "Nature delights in nature, nature conquers nature, nature rules nature," unquote. Dan says, I began to understand that the goal of psychic development is the self. There is no linear evolution. There is only a circumambulation of the self. Absolutely. And that's what we've been circumambulating for the last 3 years in this group. Good to see you here today, Dan. Zosimos, a philosopher of the 3rd century A.D., said something similar. Nature, when it is turned upon itself, transforms itself. These sentences should be interpreted in the following way. Nature consists of the inner communion of two and overcomes itself to reach a higher form. Now, let me just refer to the idea of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, since Dr. Jung's psychology is all about the opposites, and we all have many opposites within us. Indeed, we have to have opposites in our psyche in order to have psychic energy at all, and we see it play out at the time that he was giving this lecture. He was in the midst of the beginnings of World War II, and he was trying to understand the psychology of both sides in the war, since both were Christian. And so the point is that for every idea, let's take our political world for a moment, the fact that we have a red state, blue state duality is obviously very painful to us as Americans. And what needs to happen is that those two ideas have to synthesize into something new. And this is true of basically every issue that we have in our political world. They all have one side or the other, and we need to synthesize a new synthesis. And when that new synthesis happens, then again there's a thesis. Once we've synthesized, then we've got something new, another data point, and then that's a new thesis, and a new antithesis quickly emerges, and then we get still a new synthesis. So it's an ongoing process. And this is true in our own personal individuation, because we think of ourselves as one thing and then the other, and then something new emerges. The formula of Democritus originates in the feeling for nature in antiquity, when the world was not yet without soul. It expresses the conviction that nature also contains that which overcomes nature. The later conflict between nature and spirit has not yet broken out, yet the later conflict between nature and spirit has not yet broken out. They are still in a condition of a mysterious process of embrace, death, and higher birth, concealed in the womb of nature. This thought, then, that the means of higher development is enclosed in the essence of nature itself and cannot therefore be forced on nature by the will and its rational formulas, is the basis of a spiritual movement in the West, which is of a totally different kind from that which we became acquainted with in the Ignatian exercises. It is also an exercise in meditation, but of a quite particular kind, which was not usually even recognized as such, for it was a secret and successfully concealed itself behind a number of misleading designations. It called itself philosophy quite as often as alchemy, or the art of making gold. In its historical outcome, it did not flow back into a recognized form of religion, but into natural science, which all too often appeared in opposition to faith, and set knowledge and experience against belief. The essence of science is knowledge. It does not know the piety of faith, but that of investigation and of knowledge. This side of modern science originates in ancient astrology and alchemy. The development of science, which is so extraordinarily characteristic for the West, owes its origin in a great measure to the experimental attitude of mind in alchemy. Alchemy is founded on the conviction of the spontaneity of the spirit and of inspiration, and strives in untiring speculative meditation to explore the unbound spirit of nature and to give it expression. So once again, the alchemists were looking for signs of the spirit in nature. They had seen, for example, magnetism, where a magnet will either draw together or force the ends apart. And so they saw that as an evidence of an invisible spirit acting on those items. And so they were looking for those spirits in everything. And in the process, they produced a bunch of things that were very valuable to the crowned heads of Europe, which is why they kept them around. For example, one of the things that comes out of chemistry is things like paint, you name it, and also things like explosives, which were quite useful as humans were developing at that point of time, which gave people power. Although I've today seen an article about, I guess from the Atlantic, which says that if you gain power, you lose certain characteristics in your psyche, and so power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That old saying is being found to be true scientifically. Reading on. The methods which I described in my earlier lectures attempt to imprint a predetermined form on the soul, working from outside inwards, whereas alchemy endeavors to assist a psychical potentiality hidden in unconscious nature to develop and unfold to the greatest possible extent that it removes, working from inside outwards, the obstacles in the path of the hidden soul striving toward the light. It has everything which it needs in itself, was the principle on which this art of philosophy worked. The Latin for that was hab et omnia in se quo indigit. Okay. For those of you who are into Latin, if the Ignatian exercises represent, in a certain sense, the culmination of Christian determination to uplift the human being, alchemy and its philosophy represent, on the other side, an equally deep-reaching attempt to free the unconscious spirit, an attempt which is without presupposition and different to the former in every respect. With the exception of astronomy, almost every natural science has arisen to a smaller or greater degree from alchemy, and although it needed a long detour, this is also the case with modern psychology and its specific range of questions. For this reason, I have decided this winter to give you a description of alchemy to supplement my earlier lectures on the Ignatian exercises. Presumably, I'll get around to reading those in a year or two. I am aware that I am taking a great risk in making this venture, for this philosophy belongs to the most complicated spiritual phenomena which I have ever encountered. So I must ask for your silent collaboration when I come to the difficult places. It is the first time that I have ever attempted to deal with this sphere comprehensively, and I have no hope of being able to do this with the necessary clarity, for you will see for yourselves the difficulties with which I shall have to contend. Now, mind you, this is Dr. Jung speaking when he is 65 years old. From beginning this theme, I should like to give you a short summary of the foregoing lectures, because my lectures on individuation are extending over several years, and it is important that we should not lose the thread. It is a difficult subject, and one which cannot be dealt with adequately in lectures, so it is necessary to remind you from time to time of what has been said before. The main theme from this point up till the end of the third lecture is a resume of the lectures reported in the 1938-39 and the 1939-40 volumes of the ETH notes, but many new aspects appeared and several new texts were quoted. Now, by the way, I received from a mysterious source a electronic copy of the entire ETH notes, and I will be making those available in the general Dropbox under collected works. And so if you are not a member of our Dropbox and you wish to be a member, please send email to skip.conover@gmail.com, and I will be happy to provide you with access to the Dropbox. And you will then have access also to the entire set of lectures, not this later new edition, which is coming out just now, but this is the 1940, or maybe it's the 1960 version of it that was prepared by Barbara Hanna, who was one of Dr. Jung's direct disciples. He goes on. I spoke first of Indian yoga and of the Patanjali Yoga Sutra, but I will not go into this again as it would lead into too much detail. I should like, however, to remind you of the methods of meditation used in Mahayana Buddhism. We spoke of the two texts. The first was the Amity Sutra. This is an ancient text and belongs to the early days of Mahayana Buddhism. The course which this meditation takes is very characteristic. It begins with the yogin looking fixedly at the setting sun, and as you know, when you do this, we still retain an image of it after looking away. The yogin then simply concentrates on this image, and it becomes a symbol. The sun is the light, and the light represents the highest enlightenment, Buddha. Now, I urge you not to stare into the sun and think you're going to see the Buddha, because you'll blind yourself. But if you want to glance at the sun, just to get this image that you can look at in your meditation, that's different. But it's quite dangerous to stare at the sun, so I don't highly recommend that. Okay. The whole meditation takes place within the yogin. It begins with the image of the sun and ends with it again, but the image has become Buddha. The active imagination of the individual yogin has amplified it by pictures. He has filled the image with his creative imagination. After the sun has been perceived, the text says, "Next thou shouldst form the perception of the matter, clear and pure, then of ice, shining and transparent. Both these have surfaces which reflect the light. Then it becomes colored, lapis lazuli, and firm as stone. This means that the vision has gained substance. A firm foundation has been laid through active imagination." The text says, "Thou wilt see the ground consisting of lapis lazuli, transparent both within and without. This firm ground forms a basis on which the ensuing fantasy can be built up. Beneath this ground of lapis lazuli is the golden banner. Banner is a literal translation of the Sanskrit word dvaja, which really has more the sense of an emblem or symbol. This is an image which is still hidden beneath the blue surface. That is, it is in the unconscious. The surface of the water, or the mirroring surface, is the boundary between conscious and unconscious. Many people are therefore fond of talking of the latter as the subconscious because it gives them a superior feeling to be above. The symbol which lies below is the so-called mandala, a magic circle. This is generally used as a yantra in the East, a religious instrument for the purpose of supporting meditation. We find a Western form of mandala in the rose window. The mystical rose of the West corresponds more exactly to the Eastern lotus, or Padma. Buddha sits or stands in the center of the lotus, just as Christ, as Rex Gloriae, is often to be found in the center of the rose window. Mandala is a more general term. A series of 8 lakes is then formed and made real by means of active imagination. These lakes contain precious stone water and are covered with lotus flowers. The numberless rays, jewels, musical sounds, etc., are described in fullest detail and form a ground of 7 jewels for the great lotus flower. Each leaf of that lotus exhibits the colors of 100 jewels and has 84,000 veins. This is a tower built of gems on the lotus flower, and on it there are 4 posts with bejeweled banners, and on the so-called flowery throne the yogin perceives the Buddha himself. The text says, "It is your mind that is indeed Buddha." So the yogin imagines himself as this Buddha which he has created, and knows that the ocean of true and universal knowledge of all the Buddhas derives its source from one's own mind and thought. Therefore, the yogin should apply his thought to a careful meditation on Buddha, the holy and fully enlightened one. He does this in all imaginable detail. Grenade asks, would you say individuation is culturally a Western concept, or is it universal? It is certainly universal. A little bit later, after I get to the end of this, I'm going to read you something out of this, but the process of individuation is definitely universal. It's covered in The Secret of the Golden Flower, which I've done several general meetings about, and you can find those on the YouTube channel, or you can just find the PDF of The Secret of the Golden Flower and read it for yourself. That's the Buddhist version, but it comes up everywhere, literally everywhere. In the statement, your mind is indeed the Buddha, which means that the yogin's mind is now fully enlightened. He surveys the whole growth of his meditation, in that he recognizes that this Buddha which he has begotten is not only an object in itself, but is also his own subject. Now, his own subject means his psyche, his internal world. It is his mind which has been raised to the flowery throne and sits in the lotus. This lotus, this mandala, equals the sun with which the meditation began. Buddha, full of enlightenment, is the inner sun, and the yogin thus goes back, as it were, into the primeval condition of the eternal light. This is a spiritual image which we also meet in Western mysticism, as I pointed out to you in earlier lectures. The idea of Buddha as the inner sun is parallel to the Christian mystical experience of God, of the inner Christ. We read in Acts, for instance, quote, "For in him we live and move and have our being," unquote. And St. Paul says, quote, "Know ye not your own selves, how that Jesus Christ is in you?" The other text which we studied was Sri Chakra Sambhara Tantra, Holy Wheel Collected Text. Chakra is another word for mandala, and this text again is a meditation on mandala. A circle or mandala has the meaning of totality. Now, in fairness, my wife, who is a lay Buddhist teacher, took exception to the chakras being equivalent to the mandala, and I take exception to her because the chakras are about bringing up from the unconscious different levels of consciousness, and the mandala is also about bringing up different levels of consciousness. So, it's tomato, tomato. but that's what yin and yang is about, right? A circle or mandala has the meaning of totality. We know from Plato that the round thing is the perfect thing, a symbol for wholeness. So in this text, the Buddha is invoked, all-knowing one, come forward, be round, and round the mandala. This means become the totality, perfection, so that the yogin may become whole himself during this meditation. For the better he can form the Buddha, the more the Buddha is himself, built of his own substance. This conception is obviously extremely unchristian. What I would say is that what Dr. Jung is showing us is that our wholeness needs to come organically. It needs to come from within ourself. You can go to church and have the pastor preach at you for 50 years, but you're never going to know God until God emerges from within your own unconscious, and perhaps until you've had a religious experience. So that's just an observation. Okay, I'm going to carry on. Let you folks enjoy your conversation there. The text is in a disordered state, but if you study it attentively, you see that it falls into three phases: thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. The thesis, remember what I was saying a little earlier, 4 pages back, the thesis really deals with human consciousness, which is subjected to a thorough philosophical and intellectual analysis. In the first part, the different kinds of knowledge are minutely analyzed, and in the second, the functions of the conscious. So that the first phase, the thesis, really consists of a dissolution of the conscious individuality into fragments, an intensive intellectual training which has no parallel in Ignatian exercises. There are 4 kinds of knowledge and 4 functions, for the quaternity is another symbol for the totality. The simplest way of dividing the circle is into 4. The second phase is the antithesis. The thesis reaches a kind of achievement, and this is threatened by the antithesis. This threat is met by considering how the fifth in each case is the quinta essentia, Buddha essence, Buddha knowledge. The danger should be dealt with, and by imagining defenses. The attack comes from the side of the unconscious, a bad woman, the yogin's feminine side, the so-called anima, plays a leading role. She appears as 10 female devatas who threaten the yogin. We find parallels to this in Christianity. Saint Anthony of Egypt, for instance, was much tormented by such female apparitions, but in the Christian examples there is a strong moral flavor. There is no moral conflict in the East. Such figures are simply a disturbance. This disturbance or threat is finally conquered by the yogin's realization that these figures are illusion, and he avows, I am pure, which is the true nature of all things. I am of the nature of the void. The void, shunyata, is the essential essence of the world, the unfathomably deep void, which produces every kind of illusory figure, mirror images of our own psychical condition. The third phase follows the synthesis, to which we must devote special attention, for it is the synthesis that a positive edifice is erected. And so in our political debate right now over the wall, obviously our two political parties have quite different opinions about the building of the wall, and the synthesis of their two opinions will be a new edifice. That will be the synthesis that is being erected. It will be erected in some way. What that synthesis will be, we will learn later this week, perhaps. We are shown in this how the yogin transforms himself through many symbolical stages until he attains Buddha, complete enlightenment. There is a symbol sequence in 10 stages, beginning with Mount Meru, which is especially interesting to us in that these same symbols also played an important role in the Western Hemisphere, particularly in Hermetic or alchemistic philosophy. Our forefathers devoted a great deal of time to these things and would have recognized their own black arts in such Eastern texts. I have handled this series thoroughly in earlier lectures, so I will not go into detail again, but will only briefly remind you of it. This meditation also starts with a foundation, but this time it is the image of Mount Meru, the world mountain, Mount Meru. Okay, now one thing I would observe, this lecture was given in 1940, and so Dr. Jung may have been referring, when he talks about black arts, he may have been talking about the Nazi use of pagan symbology, among other things, and he was trying to get a message across without getting himself arrested by the Gestapo. This meditation also starts with a foundation, but this time it is the image of a mountain, the world mountain, Mount Meru. On this mountain there is a city with 4 fences of 4 different colors, and the city is quadrangular in shape with 3 tiers of squares thereon and 8 turrets. This must all, of course, be imagined, that is, created in fullest detail. On the top of all, a multicolored 4-headed Vajra should be imagined. Now, the Vajra is the symbol that was at the very beginning of this lecture, and I'll go on and describe it here. It will be in the thumbnail for the lecture. This is the diamond or thunderbolt, and is a well-known Tibetan symbol. The date of this text is unknown. It is quite possibly of comparatively recent origin. Many such texts have only reached Europe lately, largely owing to Sir John Woodroffe, Arthur Avalon, the edition of the tantric texts, of which the Sri Chakra Sambhara Tantra is the 7th volume. The Vajra or thunderbolt represents concentrated energy. The symbol in the center is the emblem of the popular religion in Tibet, the religion of the Red Hats. I was told by a reliable source on the borders of Tibet that this religion deals in magic and has not a very high reputation. The symbol goes left, anti-clockwise, toward the dark unconscious, which is unfavorable. The higher Buddhist Tibetan order of the Yellow Hats has the same symbol, but turning the other way, right, clockwise, toward the conscious, which is favorable. Both symbols are found together on the throne of the Dalai Lama. He unites the red and yellow hats, the two paths of Tibetan Buddhism, the path of the left hand leading to the dark and the path of the right hand leading towards the light summit of consciousness. Okay, so anyway, that's that reading. I have to tell you that my wife, who is a lay teacher of Buddhism, had to giggle when she heard that last little bit. She liked this lecture very much, but she giggled when she heard that last little bit because she said, well, the Yellow Hats must have gotten to Dr. Jung because that's not quite the way it is. But in any case, for the benefit of the listening audience, I just mentioned that. Now, 16 years later, Dr. Jung wrote Answer to Job, and toward the end of it, he put some important information about individuation. And basically, I think this is his way of saying, grow up, referring to all mankind. Excuse me. Because all of us are a little barbaric still, as he pointed out, and we need to grow up as a species. And so I'm going to read this from Answer to Job by C.G. Jung, which is in volume 11 of the collected works, and that's why this paragraph is paragraph number 745. That paragraph number refers to the paragraph in volume 11. Everything now depends on man. Immense power of destruction is given into his hand, and the question is whether he can resist the will to use it, and can temper his will with the spirit of love and wisdom. He will hardly be capable of doing so on his own unaided resources. Whatever man's wholeness or the self may mean per se, empirically it is an image of the goal of life spontaneously produced by the unconscious, irrespective of the wishes and fears of the conscious mind. It stands for the goal of the total man, for the realization of his wholeness and individuality with or without the consent of his will. The dynamic of this process is instinct, which ensures that everything which belongs to an individual's life shall enter into it, whether he consents or not, or is conscious of what is happening to him or not. Obviously, it makes a great deal of difference subjectively whether he knows what he is living out, whether he understands what he is doing, and whether he accepts responsibility for what he proposes to do or has done. The difference between conscious realization and the lack of it has been roundly formulated in the saying of Christ already quoted. Man, if indeed thou knowest what thou doest, thou art blessed, but if thou knowest not, thou art cursed and a transgressor of the law. That's from an apocryphal insertion in Luke 6:4. Before the bar of nature and fate, unconsciousness is never accepted as an excuse. On the contrary, there are very severe penalties for it. Hence, all unconscious nature longs for the light of consciousness while frantically struggling against it at the same time. The conscious realization of what is hidden and kept secret certainly confronts us with an insoluble conflict. At least this is how it appears to the conscious mind. But the symbols that rise up out of the unconscious in dreams show it rather as a confrontation of opposites, and the images of the goal represent their successful reconciliation. Something empirically demonstrable comes to our aid from the depths of our unconscious nature. It is the task of the conscious mind to understand these hints. If this does not happen, the process of individuation will nevertheless continue. The only difference is that we become its victims and are dragged along by fate toward that inescapable goal which we might have reached walking upright if only we had taken the trouble and been patient enough to understand in time the meaning of the noumena that cross our path. Now this idea is truly central to Dr. Jung's work throughout his life. And so if you haven't understood the last couple of sentences, please go back and listen to them again. And let me just read the last couple of sentences again, just to re-emphasize, because this is about a task of your conscious mind to recognize something that's going on, that's coming up from your unconscious. Something empirically demonstrable comes to our aid from the depths of our unconscious nature. It is the task of the conscious mind to understand these hints. If this does not happen, the process of individuation will nevertheless continue. The only difference is that we become its victims and are dragged along by fate toward that inescapable goal which we might have reached walking upright if only we had taken the trouble and been patient enough to understand in time the meaning of the noumena that cross our path. The only thing that really matters now is whether man can climb up to a higher moral level, to a higher plane of consciousness, in order to be equal to the superhuman powers which the fallen angels have played into his hands. But he can make no progress with himself unless he becomes very much better acquainted with his own nature. Unfortunately, a terrifying ignorance prevails in this respect, and an equally great aversion to increasing the knowledge of this intrinsic character. However, in the most unexpected quarters nowadays, we find people who can no longer blink the fact that something ought to be done with man in regard to his psychology. Unfortunately, the little word ought tells us that they do not know what to do and do not know the way that leads to the goal. We can, of course, hope for the undeserved grace of God, who hears our prayers, but God, who also does not hear our prayers, wants to become man, and for that purpose he has chosen, through the Holy Ghost, the creaturely man filled with darkness, the natural man who is tainted with original sin, and who learnt the divine arts and the sciences from the fallen angels. The guilty man is eminently suitable, and is therefore chosen to become the vessel for the continuing incarnation. Not the guiltless one who holds aloof from the world and refuses to pay his tribute to life, for in him the dark God would find no room. Now, when he's talking about this in terms of a tribute to life, what he's saying is that you have to go out and get a life, and You have to make mistakes. You have to have mistakes and troubles in your life. And only through those do you learn and become conscious of what really needs to be done. Paragraph 747. Since the apocalypse, we now know again that God is not only to be loved, but also to be feared. He fills us with evil as well as with good. Otherwise, he would not need to be feared. And because he wants to become man, the uniting of his antinomy must take place in man. This involves man in a new responsibility. He can no longer wriggle out of it on the plea of his littleness and nothingness, for the dark god has slipped the atom bomb and chemical weapons into his hands and given him the power to empty out the apocalyptic vials of wrath on his fellow creatures. Since he has been granted an almost godlike power, he can no longer remain blind and unconscious. He must know something of God's nature and of metaphysical processes if he is to understand himself and therefore achieve gnosis of the divine. So I just remind my subscribers that that passage has a special meaning to me because I had a religious experience associated with the first time that I read that passage. And if you haven't seen that experience and how it affected me directly as an example of a religious experience that Dr. Jung was referring to in these passages, then I urge you to find that video. And that video is, if you look at the playlist for Answer to Job, I intentionally, even though it's out of order, I intentionally left it at the top of the playlist, and it has a thumbnail on it, which is a picture of the 4 F-18s of the Navy Blue Angels on it. So it's pretty easy to find, and you can see a lot from that video. You need to listen to the first sentence of the video, then you see the actual experience, which comes at around between 2:20 and 2:30 of the video. And then over the next 3 minutes, you see my reaction to it coming up unconsciously. I'm still reading the passage, but you see my personal reaction to that experience just kind of bubbling up until at about 4:55, you really see it take over. And then there's some further discussion about the meaning of that particular experience to me in terms of what I'm doing here. Now I'll go back and take a look at some of your comments. Let's see. Hello, Buzz. Hello, Geezer. Thank you, Dave. I appreciate that. I've earned it, I can tell you. And Timober says, in some sense, do you have to fake it till you make it? Yeah, I guess that's a fair enough observation in the sense that, you know, when you're learning to do something, you have to fake it until you make it, until you grok it. Okay, and grok is an important term, G-R-O-K. If you don't know what it means, please look it up on Wikipedia. You can also find a definition of it in the Dropbox, but it's a deep level of understanding. And so let's, if I take my own life for an example, when I was recruited into the Marine Corps, I really had no complete appreciation of what the Marines meant. I, of course, had seen all the World War II movies, and I had been raised in a Navy family, so there were Marines around my life all the time. But then I went to OCS, which is a 10-week long program or 12-week long program, depending on how you take it. And during that time, you are definitely faking it. You're not a Marine yet, and you're not allowed to call yourself a Marine yet, and you're not allowed to wear a complete Marine Corps uniform at that time. And for example, they make you wear a helmet that is painted silver, and they call it a chrome dome. And that definitely marks you out as not one of the boys. And but by the time you complete the 10 weeks, you surely know what it means to be a Marine. And this is true whether you go to OCS or the basic school. But it's true. It must be true. And if you go to a seminary to become a priest, I'm sure for a long period of time you're not ordained, and you have to fake it until you make it there as well. So I think that's a very good observation. And Buzz says you have to be unique and drag out of the non-existent. I would add that that's true. The Marine Corps drill instructors do consider you non-existent until you drag yourself out. So if I were to help Buzz, or let's see, Buzz says the Chinese did it for a long time. Have you read The Selfish Giant by Oscar Wilde? It is a very beautiful story of walls. To be successful, you have to invent something or really make a mark, and this comes from what does not yet exist. Yeah, okay. I mean, this morning I happened to be watching the Medal of Honor ceremony of Dakota Meyer. I'll just put his name in the chat so you can look it up. But it's Medal of Honor ceremony of Dakota Meyer. Okay, now Dakota Meyer was a Marine who, is a Marine, but he's now a civilian, who won the Medal of Honor in Afghanistan. And there's some very moving videos, both of the parade that was given in his honor and also of President Obama giving him the award of the Medal of Honor. And, while I pride myself in understanding what it means to be a Marine, if you listen to that video, you'll see that there's a level of understanding that I don't understand, even though I spent 23 years in the Marine Corps, and very few do understand, but he definitely understands. And let's see. What says? Yeah, the warrior acts it out, but so does the magician. The magician has no real physical power in the physical realm, I feel. Well, that's not entirely true. Let me give you an example. I've been referred to as the magic boy, quote unquote, by my Japanese colleagues. And years ago, our partners in Japan, our business partners, we were making various kinds of pile. Now we were making narrow gauge cloth that had a pile nap to it, and it's mainly used in weather stripping. So if you look at the weather stripping in an aluminum door, you may see this high density polyethylene pile that serves as a weather stripping in the door. But one time I went to Japan and I had with me a very small sample of Teflon weather stripping. I mean, it was actually, it had a Teflon pile that was made out of Teflon yarn, believe it or not. So it was very smooth, and I showed that Teflon yarn to an engineer at Toyota, and Toyota had been making all of its cars with a little nylon wheel inside between two flanges. So the wheel's here and it's riding between two metal flanges, and those wheels were breaking down, they were squeaking, and they had various other problems with those wheels. And I showed him this Teflon pile and I described how it might be used, and he went over to the window of the room in which we were that had a little moisture on the inside, and he rubs the Teflon against the window as hard as he can, and he comes back, and within 1 week my business partners in Japan had an order for 80,000 meters of this stuff at $1 a meter, which was a very good price for us at the time. And so my Japanese business partner said, "You're a magic boy." Okay, that's the kind of magic that can be done, but it does require us to bring it into real life. It's not just imaginary, it actually happens. And I had no, as you correctly say, Martin, it has no real physical power in the physical realm, but because I made the psychic connection with that Japanese engineer, he could see what I was driving at. And because, you know, he had this little piece of pile made out of Teflon that was about 1 inch square, and you know, you can't see it physically, but you have to convey the idea psychically. And as soon as he could see it and see how it could work for him, boom, that was the answer. It was magic. It really was magic. And my partner said so. And I have many examples like that, but that's one where my partner actually saw the magic and commented on it. So yes, Grenade says the magician also created math and physics. Absolutely. And your smartphone is the work of the magician. Absolutely. Joseph Campbell says, my thoughts on Maslow. Okay, well, he has a hierarchy of needs, and so that's useful. I can't say as I know much more about Maslow than that, but I mean, I think that you can understand the hierarchy of needs by simply printing out the hierarchy of needs and looking at it, and immediately you can get it. It's not like Jung, where you have to go down and down and down and keep circling the center in order to get it. So, okay, Maslow got something. So did B.F. Skinner with the Skinner box and the dogs. Martin says, yes, you can trace back to Hermes, Thoth, Mercury, yes, all magician consciousness. And why would my video thumbnail get flagged by YouTube? am I not allowed to talk about religion? I mean, there are a lot of church thumbnails out there, but well, we'll see. Let's see. Okay, so Jonathan says, hello, what is your view on theft or stealing and karma? I would be interested to hear Carl Jung's thought on these things. Okay, that's sort of a complicated question, but let me, I mean, all of these things are relative, and so, you know, from a Buddhist point of view, and I think from a Jungian point of view, there's no clear distinction between right and wrong. They're all on a scale, and sometimes they're right and sometimes they're wrong. So lots of things that you might do in your life are wrong from one perspective and right from another. And you have to evolve your own psyche through those. That's why we have to develop our ego through having conscious experiences. We have conscious experiences, and because we have those experiences and make mistakes and see how we hurt people and various other things, we get enough of an ego so that we can decide between the right and the left side of the spirits. In other words, if you look at the first letter of John 4:1, it says, test the spirits, for many false prophets have come forward. And I'm not proposing to be a prophet. I'm simply saying that if you have a strong ego, you can make a distinction between what's right and wrong in a given situation. Would I steal to feed my baby? Of course I would, and so would everyone else. And you know, so each of us has to make those decisions in the right time. Now, as far as karma is concerned, that translates to Western idea of what goes around comes around. And in my experience, and I have long experience with karma, I can assure you, whenever I feel vengeful or angry towards someone for some slight or something they've done to me, I find that karma gets them, okay, and that I need to take no action. In other words, you know, if somebody beats you up on the playground, well, let's put it this way. There's a famous story right now about the assistant governor of the state of Virginia who committed rape, apparently, allegedly, nearly 20 years ago, but ultimately that came back and got him. And in terms of, you know, the Judge Kavanaugh and his behavior, he got away with it in the sense that he got himself on the Supreme Court. But I don't know that karma is finished with him, because I don't know how well he has hidden what happened from his daughters, or how his daughters will react to it when they are of age and know what happened. Maybe they don't know right now, and I hope they don't, but because they're children. But the fact is that he already had karma come back and get him in the form of Dr. Ford coming forward years later, 35 years later nearly, and it probably from his point of view came from left field, but karma is out there, and things happen, but I've seen things happen in other ways too, and in many other ways. And so just be careful what you do in your life and make the right decisions, because it's very clear now that if you do something stupid in college, it could come back and bite you 25 years from now or 30 years from now, when you've gotten yourself to some level of responsibility, and all of a sudden somebody that you did something to 35 years ago comes back and gets you. And whether or not the governor and the attorney general of the state of Virginia stay in office is really irrelevant, because the karmic consequences of what they did long ago are going to be biting at them for the rest of their lives, even if there's nothing that occurs on the formally legal point of view. We can be pretty sure that their political careers are finished, is what I would say. And so karma is a nasty one. If you create bad karma, it's going to come get you. You should be sure of that. Okay, I don't know about that. It's actually a religious symbol. It's not the Nazi symbol, but I may have to change that, I suppose. I see what you mean. It says, I hate how much Google and other tech giants subtly control what people think based on their own idea of morality and politics. Well, they can't ultimately control us. They can be strong at a certain level, but Jeff says that builds off of Nietzsche's notion of stripping away institutional morality. I would imagine when someone beats you up on the playground, I suppose that's right, Jeff. And says, when someone beats you up on the playground, I viewed it as a reason to learn better self-defense techniques. Well, that certainly is useful, but I'm saying you don't have to do anything about that, because that person is going to do something later in life that's going to whack them, and it just will catch them. And I have so many examples of that I couldn't even begin to tell you. And Alan says, assuming too much regarding the Kavanaugh case, okay, whatever. Buzz says, the bullies I viewed as teachers, even Martin says. Skip, I get the same knowing of karma. I also don't think people realize the power they are capable of and when not to act in some cases. I think that that's a fair observation, Martin. I agree with you. And Jonathan says, thank you, very helpful. And Grad says, bullies are the students, not the teachers. Well, I've known a few teachers that were bullies too. And, ironically, they weren't the drill instructors in the Marine Corps. I mean, those guys basically become your mother during your early stages in the Marine Corps. And they're definitely not bullies. And for example, when we train, if you go over to the U.S. Naval Academy. Over there, there's a building that houses the entire brigade of midshipmen, 4,000 men and women. And in that building is bedlam, literally bedlam, because every first-year student is required to chop, which means run down the hallway, down the center, and every time they come to a corner, they have to shout, "Go Navy," or "Beat Army," or something else. And when you have 1,000 people doing that, except during sleep hours, it is bedlam, and there's a purpose to it. And the purpose is to see if you can handle that kind of stress, that kind of sort of low grade irritation that is happening constantly. And in the Marine Corps, we had our barracks that was set up exactly next to the seaboard coastline, and so every night at 2 a.m. the train would come through, and it happened that we had a crossing right outside our barracks, and it'd go boo, boo, and wake everybody up. But that's intentional. That's to weed out the people that can't take that sort of stress. And so that wouldn't be bullying, but okay. Joseph Campbell says, one day I was wishing to see someone, and 2 hours later I saw them spontaneously. Any thoughts on the law of attraction having to do anything with synchronicity? Yes, it does certainly have a lot to do with synchronicity, but the synchronicity is like a 20-hour discussion maybe, and so I can't get into it now except to give you a very brief précis on it, which is that your mind has within it readiness for certain things. And so if wishing to see someone, that's a readiness in your mind to see someone. And then when they come, then you say, wow, okay, that's the acausal connecting principle, which it is. And it's used very heavily in divination, for example, and I discussed this heavily in the tarot, in my tarot playlist. There are 18 videos that will teach you how to read the tarot if you want to. The tarot works entirely on divination. And so what that means, entirely on synchronicity. And so what that means is that everybody has certain readiness to hear certain things. And when a tarot reader reads, the person who is listening connects with the things that they have readiness for. And so, as I've described it in the past, I can go into an auditorium with 1,000 people in it, take the tarot cards and throw them across the stage and read directly from the stage. And as long as everyone will give me the benefit of the doubt, every person in the room will hear a profound reading, but everyone will hear a different reading. And the reason they hear a different reading is they all have readiness for different things. And so they don't hear the same things. But that's why the tarot or any kind of divination works. Granat says, haha, I mean, the bullies need to be taught, not the other way around. Well, they always are taught by karma, and we're going to see a very big example of that quite soon, I think. And they are being taught. I'll leave it at that. What is a good man but a bad man's teacher? What is a bad man but a good man's job? Dao De Ching. Okay, good. I like that. Martin says 3 is the magic number for manifestation. I find intent, focus, and will. Okay, fair enough. That's an interesting way to think about it. I've been looking at these things and the significance of the Trinity also, so that's a good one. You learn that has a sting in the tail if ego wants rather than needs. I've talked about that a lot, and let me just remind you, for those who may not have seen it, let me just see if I can bring this up. I may not be able to. Let's just see. Okay, so if ego makes you want to buy a boat, you're never going to have enough. And so this boat owner owns the 63-foot motor yacht, and he's even named it Never Enough. And the sting is that the best days of his owning this boat are the day he bought it and the day he gets rid of it. But between that, as you see, he's not out on the Chesapeake Bay enjoying it. So there's a certain sting to that, that's for sure. Anyway. Skip, have you noticed the personality functions of the MBTI are also in the Tarot and archetypal? Yes, and Martin, if you go through my teaching on the Tarot, which is that 18 video playlist, you will definitely hear me talking about that. Buzz, you will meet a stranger and will find health, happiness, and wealth. Yep, that's why that's why virgin cookies work. You could write them, Buzz. You should look up Miss Fortune cookies. They make a great gag gift, and they also work equally well. Joseph Campbell says, "Is there a book you recommend to further elaborate the power to manifest?" Okay, well, I'm not going to get into manifesting, but I got a reputation in the company I worked for in Japan. We had 16 production centers outside of the United States and 16 in the United States. And I got this reputation for always being able to take an idea that someone else came up with and manifesting it better than anyone else. For whatever reason, people who have good ideas sometimes don't know how to get them done. And, somehow my intuition is always working on such things. And so, I just always am reflecting on things, and new ideas can't come up. And one of the ideas that I've been having lately is how I could help artists, because a lot of artists are introverts and they have no clue about how to handle technology or something, and somehow I have a foot in both camps, and so I could help them manifest their art. At least so goes my thinking over the last 5 days, and it's not much farther along than that, but you may start to see me interviewing artists. And by the way, if any of you that are listening to this would be interested in being interviewed about your experiences, particularly with the work of C.G. Jung, I would be happy to consider interviewing you. I started to do interviews about 2 weeks ago when I did Stephen Fox and James Dowling, who go by the name of Uberboyo, And that interview went very well, and I've done another since then. And I'm working up to do more interviews. So I'd love to have you write to me if you'd be willing to be interviewed, and we'll talk about it. And I know there are many of you that have mentioned either in chat or in various other modalities that you do have experiences, and I think that it would be interesting and useful for you to describe your experiences publicly if you're willing to. So please, if you're interested in that, please give me an email. And if you're an artist that's seeking some exposure, especially do send me an email to skipconover@gmail.com. Now it's almost mid-afternoon. Let's see. Grenad's observation is to do. That's a good idea. You never say, if you ever say try, I will try to do something. If you ever say try, it means you're not going to do it. And so rather you simply have to do. I mean, this was Yoda's advice to Luke Skywalker in Star Trek 2, but it's very, very true. You know, there's no try, you just do. Yeah, Martin, it's always trial and error. That's exactly right. And the point is, you have to be not afraid of failing. And you know, I've had many failures in my life, but I've also had many pretty substantial successes. And one of the successes at the moment is I have a fairly large group watching right now, and that's why I'm staying online. And you know, that doesn't mean that I knew what I was doing when I started this channel. I certainly didn't, and I just made mistakes, and the channel continues to grow, so I'm very pleased by that. It'd be safe to say that a person who is such an introvert and who undergoes the recurring trend of floating from group of people to group because of their superficiality as a calling of individuation. Yeah, I think that that's true. You haven't found your people yet. That's clear. And you know, my problem was I started many businesses in my life, and about half of them for other people, and about half of them were successful. And my problem was that I always left them too early because I got fed up. Let's see, I have a bothersome fuzzle here. I got bored with them, or I got fed up too early, and so I quit too early. That was my problem. And fortunately, I learned that lesson about 20 or 25 years ago, and so nowadays I don't leave anything until the last dog is hung. So Jeff says, chit chat often goes in one ear and out the other, and I often am just a quiet wallflower. You know, eventually you will move one way or another. And, you know, I find that in terms of introvert and extrovert, if I go to a party with a lot of people, I'm always over in the corner talking to one or two people. I'm never in the yuck group in the middle. And but that doesn't mean I'm any less a person. And if you look at the MBTI, all 16 personality types have very successful people in them. So you can't blame your situation on personality type, but you do have to get out and make mistakes. Okay, and that's the Job archetype: contest, defeat, lamentation, rebirth. And the more times you go through that cycle, the stronger you will be, and the more likely you are to succeed. So, Jeff, what I would say is it's fine to be a wallflower at a party, but if you are not sure of yourself, then just try something. It doesn't matter what it is. If you make a mistake, try the next thing that comes up. And, if it's a big mistake, yeah, okay, then lament about it. But then see what comes next. What's the next thing that comes? And you just keep doing that. Every day, make a mistake. And, my rule, I had 2 questions, and I'll give them to all of you. I always ask people in a job interview, what is the biggest mistake you ever made? Because it sets people back on their heels, and if they tell me a small mistake, then I know they're a liar, and if they tell me a big mistake, then I know that they have the maturity to own up to their own mistakes, and they've learned from it. Okay, I think Governor Northam of Virginia, his owning up has been a little bit, shall I say, unfulsome, but I don't think he'll make that mistake again. So and so we learn from our mistakes. None of us are perfect, and we're not going to be perfect. And the problem that young men have is that they tend to want rules, and they want to be perfect according to the rules, and you just can't do that. Okay, it doesn't work. So just make mistakes. And I used to tell my staff, if you're not making a mistake every day, you're not trying hard enough. It's very simple. I like to find a false sense of superiority. Bernard says, I like to find a false sense of superiority because my feeling faculty is repressed in favor of thinking. Yeah, that's why you need a partner. One way or another, you need a partner that's going to make wholeness of that part of yourself. And it is a constant battle. It's a battle that creates psychic energy, which is what gets us up in the morning. Did you test as NT on the MBTI? Well, and Grenade says INTJ, and that sounds very familiar. My wife is INTJ also, and I am INTP, but I guess I tend toward the J side a bit. Jeff, I suppose becoming more and more comfortable with oneself makes it less a battle over time. Yep. And my red. I mean, just knowing that after you make a mistake, no matter what it is, you can pick yourself up from it. I mean, that's a rule of life, unless you're shot dead or something. But aside from that, that's what life is, and that's the experience of life. And Bus says failure is a patient teacher, yes. And follow that bliss, yep. Jeff says, indeed, follow your bliss, big Joseph Campbell fan. And I have always been a big Joseph Campbell fan in many ways. I won't diss him in any way in today's talk. Myra says, unfortunate things are a blessing in that they are a lesson for your growth. Yes, absolutely. Buzz says, selling someone the Eiffel Tower. Well, I mean, it's built on failures. So if you're going to succeed with the Eiffel Tower, you're going to have a lot of failures first. Jeff says, perfection is a boring prospect. Yeah, I agree. That's an INFP guy, by the way. Okay. Very interesting. So we all need 2 or 3 the same in our marriages. If all 4 are the same, it's boring and nothing happens in your marriage. And if they're all 4 different, you're going to be in constant conflict. So the best strategy for finding a suitable partner is to make sure that on the MBTI you're the same on 2 or 3 of the scales, and that works pretty well. So anyway, I have to move along here because I've been going for 2.5 hours, and I promised my wife lunch, and we haven't had lunch. So I think due to your NE extroverted intuition, perfection would seem boring for sure due to the functions needed for openness. I don't know. Martin, I'm going to have to think about that one, and Jeff may want to contemplate that. There are many books, and you can get one in Barnes & Noble today, that discuss all the details, ins and outs of the Myers-Briggs. And while I love the test and love the thinking behind it, I haven't thought out every issue, so I'm not going to try to grapple with something I'm not prepared for. And so anyway, thank you for joining me today. We've had a very good group today, a very large following, and I appreciate you all being here. And this will be a playback available shortly. And Lubomir says, I'm interested, does this tower stand upwards? Well, I'm not entirely sure about that. It would depend. I think that depends on the situation and the terrain. And by the way, everyone, Lubomir has some tremendous artwork, and I would urge you to take a look at some of the work he's done recently, both on Patreon and here on YouTube. I think he has some up on YouTube, and it's very, very powerful archetypal work. So I applaud you, Lubomir, for your recent work, and I endorse it here. Jeff says he's got to finish his Paracelsus book. I have to start the Paracelsus book. Anyway, and Grenade says he has to learn about database and SQL, and all I can say is, thank God I'm past that point in my life. So, Lubomir, why don't you put a link on the chat so that others can find your art. I'm not sure I can find it quickly. Maybe I can. I'll just give it a go here. it doesn't come up quickly because I have too much going on in my computer, and let's just see if it'll come up quickly. Apologies to those of you that are expecting me to be talking at this moment. I hope you're saying something on chat because I'm looking for this. Yeah, too slow, I'm sorry, but if you copy Lubomir's name, I think you'll find his name in Patreon and probably on YouTube as well. So I urge you to take a look at that, and you'll see why the comment about the tower is very appropriate for today if you look at his Patreon page. Anyway, okay, I'm going to sign off now, and thank you for joining me today. Talk to you soon. I will be online tomorrow night at 8 p.m. for the normal weekly meeting of the group. Okay, Lubomir has a problem because it doesn't work on chat. Right. So you know, if people were to go to www.patreon.com and put in your name, they probably will find you. Jonathan asks, how should I find my personality type? There are a couple of free online tests. They are not the complete MBTI, but they are close enough for government work. So I urge you to do a search on MBTI, and you'll find an online test that you can probably take in 15 or 20 minutes maximum, and it'll immediately answer your question. And yes, there are 16 personalities, and let's see, I think lecture 4, one of the very early lectures that I did in this YouTube channel in JRG1 is the playlist for the first year of this group. And so if you go into that playlist and go to the very beginning, you will find, I think in the 4th lecture I did before I actually started interacting with people, you'll find a discussion of the Myers-Briggs there also. So anyway, good luck with that. I hope you'll find it useful.